Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge, and welcome to Keeping Relevant. My guest today is Rob Polner, an experienced writer and explainer. He's a public affairs officer at NYU, a former reporter for Newsday, as well as co-author or editor of 4 other books, each about New York political figures. We're going to talk about his recently published one, co-authored with Michael Turbide, titled An Irish Passion for Justice, The Life of Rebel Paul O'Dwyer. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. So great to see you, Ronnie.
I'm very pleased to have you. This is a really funny question to ask you. But did you know Paul was so interesting when you decided to write about him?
I had some inklings, partly because I worked with some of the columnists, or I'd met the columnists who so adored him and would talk about him or get story ideas from him. People at Newsday like Murray Kempton or Dennis Duggan or, of course, Jimmy Breslin really had him, the highest regards for him. Also, I had observed him in 1991 at the St. Patrick's Day Parade when ILGO, the Irish Lesbian Gay Organization, which the Hibernian elders had tried to keep out of the parade for various reasons, but mostly because I think as sort of a hostility at that point between the church and ACT UP, even though ILGO was an ACT UP. Paul took their side, and I saw he had a cane at that for that time. He only hobbled about 8 blocks with his then second wife, Patricia Hanrahan. Cans were thrown at him as he went further up Fifth Avenue. But I wondered, really, what was about this guy who was Irish, and much of the Irish community was more conservative than he was, sometimes by a mile, and yet he was well loved in the Irish community, and he had this, as we learned about him, an extraordinary amount of empathy, not just for the Irish. He was very Irish, of course. He was from Ireland. He had immigrated in 1925. 4 brothers were already here. One of them becomes the mayor of New York, Bill O'Dwyer, in 1946.
I'd like to talk about him later.
But Paul, what's striking is not just how long and how many causes he got involved with in campaigns, but that sense I picked up of just empathy for all groups, especially if they were underdogs or if they were marginalized, like ILGO was.
So he was born in Ireland.
Yes.
He's the 11th of 11 children?
One of the children died in childbirth, that's correct.
But his father and his mother, too, I think, were teachers.
That's right. A little town called Bohola. You would not have probably been able to find it on a map. Maybe you wouldn't find it even today. It was famous for having 3 bars on opposite corners and a very sizable Catholic church. But his neighbors were, subsistence farmers. It was a poor Irish community in the west of Ireland. And his parents were school teachers. His father was a schoolmaster at the 2-room schoolhouse, which meant that his boss was the canon of the Catholic Church.
And they fought with each other.
They fought with each other, and sometimes bitterly. Paul observed that growing up, and it developed a little bit of a distaste, I'd say, for the Catholic hierarchy when he came to America and in Ireland. He was also, I guess, a sense of anti-authority or suspicion of authority in all walks of life here in New York that drove him.
But he didn't have that. He didn't have problems in his family.
No, he was
They were very close, right?
Very close, contented kid. But the path was out of Ireland toward better economic prospects, typically men and women. He was born in 1907, and the formative, I think, origin story of Paul, what shaped him for the rest of his days, was that he came of age during the Irish War of Independence from the British colonial overmasters and the Civil War. That their histories, some of their history's most notorious characters, they had been prisoners. British used them, in many cases, British used them as auxiliaries, and they kind of rampaged and marauded and murdered across the Irish countryside. So Paul, while his family wasn't directly affected, his brothers, a few of them who were still there, participated as volunteers in the opposition, and the family house was used to hide weapons in the backyard and as a kind of safe house for these young guys.
But they managed. I mean, I was impressed with one scene with his mother managed to tell the black and tan, go, get out of here, right?
Well, I was actually,
Amazing.
I think, a British soldier, as the story
British
goes,
soldier. Okay.
came to the door looking for that tramp,
Right.
Which was one of her sons,
Right.
who was off in the hills fighting, and she stood up to him in a way that Paul remembered and sent him, back on his heels.
So as he was well educated in Ireland.
Yes, he reached a secondary level in
Yeah.
Dublin, which was more like a college level here.
But he was young when he decided to. I mean, he had 4 brothers who already came, I think, something
Yeah,
like
he
that.
had 4 brothers who came. One of them sent him a letter saying, "It's time for you to come, Paul. You're becoming a burden on your on your mom." It wasn't working then; his father had died.
Yeah.
Paul, and in the letter was from Frank,
Sad.
his brother Frank, was basically a one-way ticket on the Cunard line, second class. And Paul, he advised Paul, as the story goes, don't tell your mom. And that was not Paul. As you said, he was very close to his family. And he knew that they would come under a lot of gossip and who knows what if he snuck off. So he had a conversation with her, and she said, her name was Bridget. I don't want to get in the way of anyone's future for them to say after I'm gone that I stood in their way. And so
Must
Paul,
have been something, huh?
they had the traditional Irish wake. The shillings were passed into his pocket. He came here with about $25 in his pocket, but he was greeted and escorted up to a rooming house on 103rd and Columbus in 1925, so the middle of Prohibition, and of course the start of a clampdown by Congress on all immigrants.
So he got here, he lived here, and then he went to school. Or he got a job, didn't he, first?
Right away, you get a job, and he had a bunch of jobs culminating on the docks in Brooklyn, where he was not a guy of great stature. And Bill, the one who became mayor, looked him over and said, the cargo checker. Which meant the nets went up into the ships and he checked the cargo. He wasn't hauling it himself. And it was somewhat mechanized by that point. But that's where on the docks he sort of experienced the pluralistic character of New York City. And he really cottoned to it over time. He was, I think, alienated at first. And he went to St. John's Law School. St. John's was a school of largely Jewish immigrants. And rather than shy away, Paul found them fascinating. He made friends, and he had a very close relationship with the Jewish world in New York as he made his way.
And he became a great friend of Israel.
Became a great friend of Israel and a supporter of
Irgun or something, right?
Irgun and Menachem Begin when they were fighting the British. And that was always his motivation.
To fight the British.
He saw the British as a divide and rule kind of situation in Palestine, and that he hoped British Jews and Arabs would figure out a way to live together, but the British had to get out of the way. Of course, it was post-Holocaust, and the Jews were the greatest underdogs in the world.
Right.
And Paul was immediately drawn to raising money with a group here to help them and to fight for the Jewish state.
He did that a lot, raising money.
Yeah, he was good at that.
And forming groups.
Yeah.
He always seemed to be able. The only other person I know who formed as many groups was a guy named Al Lowenstein.
Right. He was an organizer in the Irish diaspora, and he was well known.
Right. So what's interesting is that he adapted so quickly, and he grew so quickly. I mean, he just went right ahead. But he was very determined always his whole life.
Yeah.
Nothing seemed to deter him.
He was on a trip to Ireland late in her life. His wife Kathleen, first wife of 45 years. He said, "How many great men do you think there are in the world?" And she said, she put her hand on the back of his hand and said, "I don't know, Paul, but there's one less than you think." So he had the ego, which I think served him. But when he lost an election, and as you know, Ronnie, of course, he lost many more than he won.
Yeah.
He didn't he picked himself right up off the floor.
But part of it is that he was so unrealistic in the elections, in a lot of the elections that he ran in.
I agree with you there. There
What
were
happened
elections.
to his reasoning?
I think it was a bit of a game of musical chairs in those days. I think he also felt anyone should be able to run, and I think ego played a role. There was a race in 1976 where he was encouraged by the state committee of the Democrats, the chairman, and to run against Bella Abzug, and also Ramsey Clark, a fellow liberal. And what that was done.
That was the mayoral campaign.
No, it was a Senate race in 1976. This is the one that Daniel Patrick
Right.
Moynihan, and they were encouraged to run because the chairman of the party wanted Moynihan to win, who was more conservative or viewed that way
Right.
than certainly Bella Abzug. But why did Paul run? I think it's questionable because, his politics were just as left as Bella's, and
Yeah.
the Senate was, of course, she called it the Stag Senate,
Right.
of course, all male virtually.
Right. But did he feel guilty at all afterwards?
He did.
She lost by so little.
Guilty might be too strong a word, but he did reach out to try to apologize.
Did she ever forgive him? No.
I don't believe she ever got back to him.
Yeah.
I think there were efforts also made during the race to get him to bow out, and he did not. Maybe he thought he could pull a rabbit out of the hat, or maybe he so wanted to be in Congress on the Irish issue. That was at his heart. And however, it was such a close race that the Bella forces, let's say, if not Bella herself, resented Paul
Right.
for having stayed in the race. And that backfired on Paul when he ran for re-election as the city council president in 1977, where a woman,
Right, Carol Bellamy.
Carol Bellamy
Right.
was the victor.
But at the same time that Paul went to all these different causes and very actively, I mean, he campaigned actively in the South, and
Yeah.
he never forgot the Irish. He was also a very canny lawyer,
Correct.
and he took all kinds of cases.
Right.
They weren't just principled cases.
Right. Well, the law firm O'Dwyer and Bernstein, Oscar Bernstein was the first law firm he worked at, and then became his partner when he was coming out of law school initially. And there's an interesting part of the book about his days as a fledgling criminal lawyer in the courthouse in Brooklyn in a very corrupt time in Brooklyn's history. So that's interesting.
And he took a lot of pro bono work that was assigned to him.
Yes, that was the case, unless it was a capital case. And he had, I think, 7 capital cases, death penalty cases, of which one of his clients went to the death penalty, and he bitter about that till the end of his days.
Yeah.
Because the death penalty was so common in Brooklyn in the 1930s. I was surprised to read about that. But Paul, yes, his little law firm near City Hall, O'Dwyer and Bernstein, now we're in the 60s, 70s, took more pro bono civil rights cases than virtually any firm in New York, including the big ones. He was known for that. At the same time, they paid the rent and paid the payroll with kind of workers' comp cases, I guess, accident falls and labor
Right.
unions.
Yeah. And he was Jimmy's lawyer. So
Right.
he did contract work.
That's right. He was all over the place.
Yeah.
He was a very talented at cross-examination on defense. And we saw that when he defended in the early 70s Phil Berrigan and the Catholic New Left,
Right.
which were being prosecuted by Hoover and the Nixon justice.
Right.
And that was a victory. And Ramsey Clark was on that, among others.
That was it was so poignant or something for me to read this book. I have to admit, I had difficulty starting.
Yeah.
It was a little heavy. I've never understood the Irish history.
Okay.
It's too confusing. I still don't really understand
Yeah.
it. But let's start with the Irish history. Paul put his mind to it. He got the President of the United States to really push for a compromise.
Right.
Right?
Right. 1992,
Yeah.
the primary in which Clinton was participating as still the governor of Arkansas, I guess. They got him to attend a debate on Irish issues that was held at the Sheraton. It was kind of pre-scripted. He knew what the questions would be from a variety of Irish journalists. Bill enters the small room. First hand he shakes is Paul, who's the senior elder statesman at this point. Certainly the New York, but I think the American Irish community in many ways. And he precedes Bill Clinton to agree to bring Jerry Adams, the IRA leader, give him a temporary passport to come into America for a few days, which had been denied him. And more importantly, I think, was that he would appoint an envoy to Northern Ireland. And he goes on and does that. And then we have a
very talented one, George Mitchell.
That's right, extremely talented. This is a multi-party, complex set of agreements that ultimately result. But Paul was there at the beginning, and in a way he was there at the end. He dies probably not fully realizing that it had happened, but I think he saw it coming, which was the end of the 30-year horrors and violence of the sectarian.
Now that was a compromise.
Yes.
It took all the different parties. But he refused to compromise when he ran for the Senate in 1968.
Right.
And this was very poignant for me because I lived through a lot of these things. And at my age, when you're trying to look back on your life and you figure out what you did, and in a way we're so minute in the long history.
Yes.
But certain occasions hang out with you.
Well, I think he can be faulted, Ronnie, for waiting until 2 days before the election to endorse Hubert Humphrey. Right. A lot of the people in the Democratic Reform movement, of which you're very familiar, and Paul actually was one of the founders, in a way, of the earliest participant in the late 50s with Eleanor Roosevelt and Governor Herbert Lehman in starting it, and it was very influential in by the time of the anti-war movement here in New York and beyond. But Paul stuck with Eugene McCarthy, who, although he was out of the race, and loyalty was a big factor in his thinking, and I guess he was stubborn. He probably viewed Humphrey as a hack, as many people in that movement did. But Nixon was already, was going to make the war much worse.
Right.
So I think people really, Ronnie, can learn from Paul's both his mistakes.
But I wasn't talking about that part of it.
Okay.
I was talking about the early part of it, when McCarthy decided to run against Johnson early, before Johnson withdrew. And this was all the anti-war pressure and all these different players. Some of us, as time went on, supported Kennedy after he came in the race rather than McCarthy. And then some of us decided if we could make the different elections anti-Vietnam when we're running for delegates for the different states, if we'd support delegates who were pledged against the war, we would avoid the split between Kennedy and McCarthy. And that's when it was an important compromise, which Paul wouldn't have anything to do with.
You're right. He
ran independent. He ran separate. Yeah.
And he had committed already to McCarthy
and
before
the committee
Kennedy entered.
And the Democrats did too. His part of the Democratic.
And he didn't go back on his word. But there was I think you're right. There was a lack of flexibility there that you would expect from a politician, and
especially somebody like him.
And he did not do that.
Yeah.
Nor when he surprisingly won the primary for U.S. Senate in 1968 did he go to the leaders of the party.
That's what I meant.
Right.
In 68.
Right.
We were running Kennedy delegates, which we shouldn't have done. We were running McCarthy delegates.
Right.
They were running originally Johnson, and we should have been together, those people who are against the war. And
right. I think that's true. I think you're right.
But I was a more pragmatic politician, I think.
Right. I think Paul was, I would call him a cause-oriented politician.
Yeah.
I mean, he was even known
he didn't have
to leave the campaign trail to, let's say, walk with striking brewery workers as
They
he
must-
did in 1948 when he ran the first time for Congress
Must
against
have driven them crazy, huh?
and then he ends up losing to Jake Javits in Inwood by so close, he had to admit, maybe if I'd stayed on the trail, I would have won.
The book turned out, when I said I had difficulty starting it, then I got into it and I couldn't stop reading it because it's more than just a story about Paul. It's a
Right.
story about the times.
Right.
And it's exciting and it's really so interesting. One of the parts that you also talked about is his brother.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
Right. So Paul's eldest brother, as I said, the first to arrive here in New York, and actually Paul meets him here in New York for the first time in 1925, is Bill O'Dwyer. Bill is this remarkably charming, kind of crowd-pleasing, room-pleasing personality.
He was an Irish politician.
He was an Irish politician. He
4 stars.
rose his way up through the ranks in the days of of Tammany Hall, Brooklyn Democratic organization, and all the way becoming magistrate almost by his own hand, which is an interesting tale, and then ultimately DA of Brooklyn, who becomes famous for breaking up Murder Incorporated.
And I have a funny personal story about that, too. I have a friend who was the niece of Mindy Weiss,
Oh,
and I was at their apartment when he was executed. Now, how about that?
oh my gosh.
So anyway, go
Yeah.
on, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, my father grew up in Brownsville and remembered some of the characters floating around in those years. But yes,
And I once told Jimmy that I didn't know any Jewish gangsters. And this friend of mine said, what about Murder Incorporated? Anyway,
yeah, the joke was the kosher nostra, I guess. Was, there's Italians as
that's
well.
a good one.
But, you know, Murder, you could see the movie, I think it was 1960, about Murder Incorporated. Famous stories in there. Bill was an accommodationist by nature and I think by necessity to make it out of nowhere. He was a working class immigrant to just charm. He was a cop for 7 years, and then he became a lawyer. And he worked his way up the ranks to DA. There were allegations that he was covering some stuff up that would have been very embarrassing to key participants in the Longshoremen's Union, some of them lethal. And he wins the mayoralty after LaGuardia and wins the huge margins, very popular. And what happens to Bill is that New York, it was such a time of transition and complexity in New York life, I think, at those post-war years. But at a certain point, the bosses of Tammany Hall, who are all powerful then, it wasn't money, it wasn't obviously television. It was who you had to do the bidding of the bosses, whether for good reasons or bad, and it was a tough road to navigate. I think Bill was a very serious guy. He was an intelligent man, but he was ultimately became inconvenient to the bosses amid a big bookmaker police scandal. The character at the center of it was named Harry Gross. It was 1950, and it was the first year of Bill's second term. Where he had been reluctant to run for a second term because of his health, but he did it for the bosses. And then when he became inconvenient to them, out he went. But they didn't just put him on the curb. They arranged for him to be the ambassador to Mexico. He had a longstanding interest in that part of the world. And Truman and the Senate, nominated and confirmed him. But he was a pariah, and he was investigated. You think about Adams now, he was investigated city, state, federal, never any criminality found or established, but he was...
Hung over him.
It hung over him it destroyed him. And he was at the center of the Kefauver committee hearings, became kind of the poster child for municipal corruption and tie-ups with the mob. It was unfair, but this was the Cold War now, and those sort of what have been mundane, ordinary things in New York life, not to recommend them, that LaGuardia railed against, became sinister, had international kind of, tones to them in the hands of the Kefauver Committee.
So, we're running out of time, and I'm very sorry because there's so much more to talk about. But what are you going to do next?
Just take a break for a while, Ronnie. I don't have a subject matter just yet.
But will it be another New York personality, you think?
Maybe not. Maybe because people's attention is so on the national scene now, and but what I think I like about Paul is we're kind of on the scales between hope and despair, or right now, and maybe even dropping out of the process entirely. And he's a good example of someone who really persevered.
Definitely. And let's just go back to the O'Dwyer, his brother. Paul never, ever left him alone, dangling. He
Right.
supported him through his entire life.
That's right. And even when it probably would have helped Paul to put a little distance there,
Yeah.
that wasn't in his makeup.
Right.
Family loyalty, just loyalty in general, was a big part of his character and why he was so beloved. And that really came across in all the interviews we did for the book.
Yeah, you're right. It's a life like Paul's, well-lived, interested with the world and the community that makes a difference, and we need that now.
I agree.
Thank you very much, Rob Polner.
Thank you, Ronnie.
CUNY TV now has an app. Downloading the app will let you watch any show, including mine, at your convenience.